Okay, here we are in part 3 of our lecture video series from Monday, February 27th. We just wrapped up our periodic trends, and now we are moving into our new topic, which is the idea of chemical bonding. So if we're going to describe chemical bonding, we better have a functional definition. So let's begin there. What is a chemical bond? So in a most general sense, a chemical bond is some associative force between atoms in a molecule that causes atoms to stick, if you will, together. So for example, if we recall something like, I don't know, ammonia, NH3, this means we have one nitrogen atom for every 3 hydrogen atoms for every one molecule. But how are these put together, right? How is it that I know that there's an association between these 4 atoms? Is it that I've got a hydrogen bonded to a hydrogen? Is it that I've got a nitrogen bonded to a hydrogen? Is it that I've got a nitrogen bonded to all 3? Like, what is it that is causing all of these atoms to stick together to form this molecule, ammonia? So it turns out that when it comes to chemical bonding, there's actually multiple different ways that atoms can associate to quote unquote stick together. And before we can talk about those different types of associations, let's just remind ourselves of our kind of 2 flavors of compounds. So the first, we have an ionic compound, which we know is comprised of some kind of ion coming together with another kind of ion, specifically some kind of metal and some kind of nonmetal. Though we do see things like a metal cation with some of our polyatomic anions. We also see things like a polyatomic cation with some nonmetal anion. And we also see combinations of polyatomic ions. So we have a polyatomic cation coming together with a polyatomic anion. In other words, ionic compounds are things that are inherently formed by charge associations or electrostatic attractions are what hold our atoms together. So for example, if I had something like magnesium hydroxide, I would recognize that this comes from the magnesium 2 plus being associated with 2 different hydroxide anions, where that association is the negative charges on each of the hydroxides being attracted to the positive charge on the magnesium. So we would call this the bond, the force that holds these atoms together in this molecule. Now, the next type of compound that we looked at were called covalent. compounds. And covalent compounds, as we recall, these are clusters of nonmetals that are bonded together. This excludes our polyatomic ions. So there is no electrostatic attraction that's holding these compounds together. So then what is it? Why is it that we see things like H2 gas or H2O? What's going on here? Well, let's break down this word. Covalent. Co, together, valence, that's talking about valence electrons. So in a covalent compound, our atoms are held together by some association of valence electrons. And I'm intentionally being vague because we're going to go over this in a moment. But if you're asking yourself, what do you mean some association of valence electrons? Like, why would valence electrons want to be involved with one another anyway? We have to remind ourselves that the whole driving reason why anything does anything at all in the universe is to achieve some kind of energetically stable state. And remember, when talking about electrons, specifically valence electrons, we know that atoms are stabilized when they have 8 valence electrons. Now, this is true for the ionic compounds as well, right? Like, why do we have ions in the first place? But in covalent compounds, if you're wondering, like, how is it that we can have an association between valence electrons that doesn't involve, like, the ionization happening? It's going to be to some reason that we call the covalent sharing, meaning that our compounds are formed because our atoms are achieving octet, or they're achieving 8 valence electrons through means other than creating ions, which is the complete removal or the complete acceptance of new electrons. So we are going to talk about these two different bonds in our next video, which is the idea of an ionic bond and a covalent bond.